Before you go wishing for the simpler golden times of the past, you should probably know that finding a meaningful and fulfilling job back then was an alien concept. Jobs were more crafts than professions and as bizarre as they could get. In today's video, we'll brave the tough medieval times and discover 11 bizarre jobs that seem more fiction than reality, but actually existed. Welcome to Untold History Guy, where you can find fun, fascinating, and sometimes shocking chronicles of history. Join us as we journey back and uncover the untold truths of the past. Rat catcher. Those who weren't skilled enough to be bakers or blacksmiths could still make a decent income as rat catchers. After all, the minimum requirements for this entry-level job position were a handful of cats, adequate knowledge of setting traps, and a cage from which to hang the little criminals. At a time when Europe was battling the Black Death, rat catchers were in high demand for their surefire abilities to eliminate the vermin that were responsible for spreading this deadly disease. Unlike our modern exterminators, medieval rat catchers had a more hands-on approach to dealing with the black rats that caused more deaths than World War I and World War II combined. They had well-trained cats that showed no mercy to their arch-enemies, and other times they literally got their hands dirty by crawling into unsanitary places and catching the little rascals with their bare hands. If you're wondering if they were immune to the Black Death Plague, no, they were not. Gong Farmer. As far as dream jobs go, being a gong farmer was most certainly not one of them. The modern drainage and plumbing systems we take for granted today weren't there in medieval times, but human waste still had to be taken care of somehow. Hence, the gong farmers. These unappreciated lads had the displeasure of digging out and disposing accumulated human excrement at dump sites far from town. With as few as 16 houses of easement for as many as 30,000 people, I can't even begin to imagine the magnitude of their workload. And don't even get me started on the smell. Gong farmers were only allowed to work at night, and some of them spent their nights knee, waist, or even neck deep in, well, poop. It was common for them to die of diseases or suffocation while toiling away in the poorly ventilated cesspits. To thank them for their much-needed services, people avoided them like the plague and spared them no handshakes or hugs. Their punishment for failing to dispose of the waste properly was being forced into a pit of fecal waste up to their necks and then publicly disgraced. So the next time you flush your toilet, kindly observe a moment of silence for these forgotten yet diligent poop collectors. Pis Prophet. Now, before you accuse me of making up this name, let me assure you that this was a real, respectable job in medieval times. Also called a water-scriger, a Pis Prophet was a doctor who could diagnose diseases from the smell, sight, and, wait for it, taste of a patient's urine. I know this sounds gross and insane, but the people who did this job were well within the scientific scope. Did you know that diabetes makes the urine sweet? Or that blood in the urine can be a sign of a UTI? So, by smelling, tasting, and looking at urine, medieval Pis Prophets were able to diagnose such conditions and more. Since this was a widely accepted job, the risk of going to a quack Pis Prophet was pretty high. Victims of such encounters received questionable diagnoses or harmful treatments that could put their health at even worse risk. So let's just thank science for modern innovations, shall we? Groom of the Stool. Where the lords and barons of the king's court had the pleasure of advising and entertaining the king, the groom of the stool was committed to assisting him with his toileting needs. Now, you might find this job bizarre and distasteful when compared to other jobs at the palace, but it was highly sought after in late medieval times. So, before you scrunch your nose and shudder in disgust at the mention of the word toilet, why don't we dive into the nitty-gritty of what made this job so enticing? You might want to set your food aside for a minute, though. As a groom of the stool, this servant had to ensure that towels, water, and a washing bowl were at the ready after the king took care of his business. He usually tracked how often the king ate, which helped him to anticipate when the king would need to use the toilet. He also took note of the king's bowel movements to give a satisfactory report about his health to the doctor. Anything out of the ordinary was to be brought to the doctor's attention so that the king could receive the necessary treatment. There's a hot debate as to whether the groom of the stool also wiped the king's behind, but I'd like to live the rest of my life believing that he didn't. Barber Surgeon. Just from the name alone, you can tell that this was no ordinary job. I mean, have you met a barber who can perform surgery? For medieval people, however, this was a pretty common occurrence. And it's not like these people had received any formal training on carrying out medieval surgeries or anything. No, it was their existing skills in wielding razors and knives that made them the next best option to real trained surgeons. Also, most of the trained physicians had succumbed to the Black Death in the 14th and 15th centuries. So people thought that if barbers could use knives and razors so well on hair, why not take it up a notch and let them remove teeth or amputate body parts? Barbers rose to the challenge and became quite adept at performing minor surgeries. Some even became flying barbers and began traveling from town to town to partake in their newfound talents. Witch hunter. Europe had its first systematic witch hunt in 1428, which began in Switzerland and lasted for up to 8 years. During this period, a sanctimonious witch hunter acted as judge, jury, and executioner at witch trials that killed 367 people. Contrary to what their name suggests, witch hunters didn't necessarily move from town to hunt witches. By the time a witch hunter arrived in town, a poor suspect had already been identified, and it was the witch hunter's job to torture a confession out of her. Witch hunters attempted to be fair and just during the trials, but their methods of eliciting confessions were anything but. They deprived the suspects of sleep, interrogated them to exhaustion, or drowned them repeatedly. They didn't like being proved wrong. If they said you could turn into a werewolf or fly, they wouldn't stop torturing you until you bought into their beliefs about you. They also identified witches through some pretty wild methods they probably learned in their non-existent classes. A suspect was thrown into the water with a rope tied around their waist. If she sank, she was innocent. If she floated, she was a witch. Others were pricked with sharp objects, and if they didn't bleed, then they had demonic powers flowing through their veins. They were most suspicious of single and elderly women, or those with a bad temper or a loose mouth. But once a witch hunter set his sights on you, well, goodbyes were in order. Flatulist. Medieval people sourced their entertainment from different things, including the measured rhymes of a fart. These tough feats were accomplished by professional comedians called flatulists, who could pass gas in musical or creative manners for the amusement of others. This job was so famous that there were flatulist celebrities in medieval times. Prominent figures like Roland the Farter were known for their impressive ability to pass the wind at will and continuously, as if they were actually singing. Galley Rower. While some jobs were as easy as passing gas, others were so grueling that people sought refuge in the priesthood. And when a man chooses celibacy over work, you can tell that being a galley rower was not for the faint of heart. This job required teams of men who would row the ship for months on end. It was initially an honorable job among freemen, but as time passed and the demands increased, it became a job forced upon poor peasants or slaves. Galley rowers lived at the bottom of the ship in cramped environments, with the harsh and grueling demands of the job leaving very few chances of survival. Unfortunately, they had no option but to keep the ship afloat, as any dallying on their part, and they were the first to go. Bear leader. How would you like leading a wild bear from place to place for other people's amusement? Since I like having my head attached to my neck, I'm saying not very much. Interestingly enough, someone in medieval times actually made his income from doing exactly this. Referred to as a bear leader, his job was to take his bear to different villages for a type of blood sport called bear baiting. This is where a pack of dogs was set free to bait and fight against a caged bear. There's no record of how these people actually captured the bears to begin with, but I wouldn't feel sorry for them if a bear escaped and had a little fun for itself. Arming Squire. Even though being a knight was a noble and honorable job, it seemed like an elusive dream when you started as an arming squire. Aged between 13 and 18 years old, an arming squire was like the personal assistant of a knight, but with no health insurance. His job was to set up the knight's camp, wait on him, and even guard him as he slept at night. The highlight of his day was when he had to clean up the blood, mud, and sweat on his knight's armor by using vinegar, sand, and urine. In case his knight's armor broke during battle, the arming squire was supposed to run into the battle unprotected and replace it. Clearly, bravery was best taught at the hands of death. Fuller. Before the invention of a watermill, people in medieval times employed fullers to clean their woolen clothes. Unfortunately, the only detergent that could effectively whiten and soften wool was stale human urine. A fuller had to march up and down on urine-soaked wool for most of the day to get the job done. Then they would rinse it with water and it'd be as good as new. Well, what are your thoughts on these bizarre jobs that our ancestors relied on to bring bread to the table? Which one wouldn't you be caught dead doing? Let us know in the comments below and check out our other videos for more entertaining content.